morning. I'm Kim Mccleary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all so very much for joining us and for your continuing contributions to help support our programming. The staff and I are working very hard to have a lineup, develop a strong lineup of programming through the summer, the fall, and well into 2021. So please go to our website at lawac.org to register for our events, and please consider making a donation or becoming a member. That's the way that we can continue to provide you with the quality programming like today. The very popular Politics in the Time of Coronavirus with politics professor Dan Schnur. In addition to Dan's academic work at UC Berkeley, USC, and Pepperdine, he's also a member of the board of directors of the World Affairs Council, and also he's co-chair of our programs committee. So we are always open to your ideas for future programs. In light of today's Supreme Court decision, Dan would like to talk about that as one of our topics. We will also be talking about the changing U.S. role in the Middle East, annexation update, and whatever happened to police reform. We'll explore the topic on minority voters at a future webinar. Dan, it's time for me to turn it over to you. Can't wait about the Supreme Court discussion.
Well, Kim, thanks so much for having me, and thanks to all of you for joining us again today for another discussion of politics in the time of coronavirus. Kim and I were talking just before the program started, and she commented on what extraordinary timing this was for our very selfish purposes of being able to talk about the court decision only hours after it was issued. I think what most of you probably do not know is that John Roberts owed Kim a pretty big favor, and so he timed the announcement of both of these decisions to work for our program today. So Kim, thanks for using that Roberts favor on our behalf, although I bet that at least some of our participants would hope that you would have saved it for something of more substantive value. So in any case, as all of you probably know by now, the Supreme Court made two immense decisions this morning. Earlier today, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected President Trump's assertion that he should have absolute immunity from investigation while in office. And that was discussed in a couple of different contexts. First, in one case, it allows a New York prosecutor to pursue a subpoena of the president's private and business financial records relating to allegations against the president that hush money was paid to two women with whom he was involved in extramarital relationships some years ago. So that's one case, and that by a 7-2 margin, the U.S. Supreme Court decided that in fact Trump did need to meet the request as a subpoena, that even as President of the United States, he's not immune from those types of requests and demands. Then the second case, decision which went in the other direction. There was, in addition to the request from the New York City District Attorney over Trump's business records, there's been a series of congressional subpoenas for Trump's tax returns and other financial records. And the court decided to send that case back to lower courts because they do not believe that the lower courts address the separation of powers questions between the executive and the legislative branch to their satisfaction. So what we're going to do now is we're going to change the format a little bit. Normally, as the regular participants know, I talk for a while and then we put a question to you for your input. But we're going to switch that today. And Claire and I are going to start each of our three topics by posing a question to you. And then I'll use your responses and your opinions as the basis for the rest of the conversation going forward. So Claire, two big Supreme Court decisions today. Let's put up the first question for our participants. So question for all of you. Do you think that today's Supreme Court decisions will make Trump's re-election more likely, less likely, or make no difference? We'll ask you to select one of the following. And it is worth noting, I did not mention this at the outset, that although the New York case was decided against President Trump, there is also additional legal work that needs to be done on that front. So it's fairly clear that in neither case will the financial records themselves be available to the voting public before the election. In the congressional subpoena case, that's going to require a lower court decision before the case goes back to the Supreme Court. So that's going to take a great deal of time. But on the New York case also, there's further work to be done. And so it is very, very unlikely, borderline impossible, that the New York grand jury examining those financial records will have completed their work so that the information can become public. And although it will ultimately become public, it will almost certainly not become public before November. So Claire, let's see what the responses are from our group, if we can put those up. 3% of you think that the decisions make Trump's reelection more likely. 19%, roughly 1 in 5 of you, say that it makes the president's reelection less likely. And 78%, more than 3/4 of you, probably for the reasons that I just mentioned, said that it would not make a difference in the campaign. And I think I will say this, now that you've all weighed in on your opinion, I would agree with you. I think it's unlikely to make a big difference. It's certainly an argument that Joe Biden and Democrats can make against the president, that even the US Supreme Court has decided that he's not entitled to absolute immunity and that he will have to make those financial records public. But the fact that those records will not be public before November makes it less likely that it's going to have the type of dramatic impact that many of the president's opponents and other court watchers were expecting. For the 19% of you who said that it would make his reelection less likely, I do understand your thinking, because as I mentioned a moment ago, even though we're not going to see the particulars of his tax records and his business dealings, simply the fact that the court ruled against him is a powerful argument that his opponents can use in the campaign. But I suspect that at Biden headquarters and elsewhere in the country today, there's more disappointment than happiness, because the details of that information will not yet be public. So I think the way to look at it, at least my perspective is that this was a legal defeat for the president. Make no mistake about it. He's been asserting absolute immunity, and that as president, he cannot be charged with any crime, cannot be the target of any subpoena. He's completely immune from any type of legal proceedings. And he lost that case in the US Supreme Court. And my own amateur legal opinion suspects that when the congressional case comes back before the court, once the lower courts have addressed it again, I suspect that the US Supreme Court, just as they ruled against absolute immunity for Donald Trump in the New York case, will ultimately rule against him on the matter of the congressional subpoenas as well. So that's a legal defeat for the president. Make no mistake about it. One big defeat today and another one probably sometime in the next year or so. But it's a political victory for him, because the details of that information will not be public. And actually, now that I hear myself talk, calling it a political victory for him is probably a little bit of an overstatement. But let's agree that President Trump has dodged a political bullet today. And while there'll be some unpleasantness and difficulty for him and his allies addressing the court decision, it's not nearly the kind of political challenge that it would have presented otherwise. It looks like, and there's a longer discussion that we can have during your questions, which we'll come to a little bit later, of course, that the court was looking to avoid these difficult decisions. And this is a hallmark of the Roberts Court. He is a conciliator whenever he can be, and looks for a way, to a much greater degree than either William Rehnquist or Warren Burger, his conservative and liberal predecessors, looks for a way whenever possible to consolidate opinions on the court. And this looks like an effort on Roberts's part to avoid drawing his court into the crosshairs of the 2020 presidential election. A lot more to talk about on this front, but I think the bottom line is legal defeat for Donald Trump today, and if not a political victory, at least somewhat of a political escape. So let's go on to our second question. Our second question is, we're going to talk about police reform. Now, as all of you know, it's only been about 6 weeks since the tragic death of George Floyd at the hands of the Minneapolis police officers currently, allegedly, who are being accused of these crimes. And it's only been a few weeks since protests swept all of the major cities in this country, and since congressional leaders of both parties vowed to address the issue of police reform. Now, Republican Senator Tim Scott, the only African-American Republican in the United States Senate, put together a package of police reform proposals. That is, we talked about week before last, I believe. The Democrats in the Senate voted not to hear, and so the package was defeated. And what it has appeared is, despite the incredible public desire for police reform, and given the stated desire of both leading Republicans and Democrats in Washington to do something significant on this front, that the typical gridlock and polarization in Congress may have cost us the bill. There's some murmurings of possible progress out of Washington just in the last day or so. I'll talk more about those in just a minute. Before I go any further, though, let's put up the second question, Claire, and let's get the opinion of our group here. And let's find out what you think. Will Congress pass a police reform bill before the election? They're out of session now through the end of next week. And when they come back a week from Monday, they'll only have 11 working days to pass necessary legislation relating to the COVID-19 virus. And then after that, they go out of session, and most of the fall, in even numbered years, Congress is back in their districts and states on the campaign trail rather than in Washington. So it's a pretty tight calendar for police reform. And let's see what your thoughts are, whether you think that passage is likely or not. Well, this is a pretty skeptical group we have here, but I think I knew that already. 20% of you believe that police reform will pass before the election in November. 80%, 4/5 of you, say that it will not. And what I do want to do, just to go back to a point I was making earlier, is to let you know that while I too, like most of you, am very skeptical about the prospects for reform, both parties seemed much more interested in drawing lines in the sand than looking for reasonable compromise. We do see some glimmers just in the last 24 hours out of Washington, and to a large degree, that potential for progress is a result of the work of Representative Karen Bass, our U.S. member of Congress from here in Los Angeles. And as many of you know, it has been reported that Representative Bass is now on a relatively short list of candidates who Vice President Biden is considering to be his own running mate. And so it's been reported just overnight that in the last few days, after the bill seemed dead, Representative Bass went to Senator Scott to say to him, this is too important to let die, and they have begun negotiations again. There's a few things to watch going forward, and always mindful of the fact that the urgency of passing coronavirus related legislation at the end of the month may likely take precedent over any efforts on this front. But there have been a few sticking points in the congressional debate over police reform that we should keep an eye on going forward. The most difficult by far is the question of qualified immunity. In other words, should police officers continue to receive legal protections, from lawsuits or other legal actions against them as a result of violence committed during their pursuit or apprehension of criminals? And that looks like it had been an unbridgeable gap. The Democrats have said that qualified immunity, that these legal protections are unacceptable and they need to go away. And Republicans have been equally insistent that they need to remain in some form. And the word out of Washington is that what Senator Scott and Representative Bass are working on is a compromise. Imagine that, a compromise in Washington, D.C. And the idea would be to provide legal protections, to eliminate qualified immunity for police departments, but not for police officers. So if you were the victim of some type of police misconduct, you would have the recourse of going to court, which is not available now, to sue the police department, but not the individual officer him or herself. We'll see if anything else comes on that. There's also a discussion going on about whether and how to collect data on racial profiling. And then finally, the last major disagreement is on the question of chokeholds and other types of more extreme police apprehension techniques. Now, neither side is in favor of chokeholds, but the difference is the Democrats are calling for an absolute ban on the use of that technique, whereas Republicans are talking about blocking all federal funding to any police department that doesn't ban chokeholds themselves. And that's a federal versus local government discussion, which at least theoretically could potentially lead to compromise. We'll see more in the weeks ahead to see if the 80% of you who are skeptics are right, or if Congress, given the leadership of Representative Bass and Senator Scott, might be able to break the gridlock and the gamesmanship on such an important issue. Third and finally, we're going to talk a little bit today about Israel and the Middle East. And I should tell you that even before we get into this discussion, I should tell you about some of the feedback I've gotten from people I know around Los Angeles and elsewhere when they saw that this topic was coming up for discussion this week in the emails that Claire and Jessica and the team send out each week. I will tell you this: I have never, in the months that we've been doing this program, I've never gotten as many emails from people in advance of a topic discussion than this one, which I think shows just what an emotionally fraught set of issues Israel and Middle Eastern policy present to all of us. One of the things I heard, which I think is very interesting, is many people I heard from, people I respect, argued even with the language that we chose to use, that I chose to use in the advance notice on the topics. We talked about this as an annexation update. And what a number of allies of the Israeli government have argued is that the term annexation is inaccurate in that it's misleading. Their argument is that the term annexation implies that a country is taking over territory that belongs to someone else. And their argument is that the area of the West Bank, while control over it has been disputed pretty much nonstop since 1967, is that it does not indisputably belong to the Palestinian Authority. Their argument is that the last country to maintain absolute authority over the West Bank was, depending on how you count, either Egypt or possibly Great Britain. But the term that they prefer to use, as opposed to annexation, is sovereignty. And so what I'll do, in fairness to both sides of the debate here, is I'll talk about this as the annexation sovereignty debate for the next few minutes, and then as questions come up about it as we go forward. And so the question at hand here is whether the disputed area of the West Bank should be under the authority of Israel or the Palestinian Authority or some combination. Most of you know that this is the territory west of the Jordan River that was occupied by Israel in 1967 as a result of the settlement at the end of the Six-Day War. Now, in the 1990s, when the Oslo Accords were signed, Israel and the Palestinian leadership agreed to divide up the land in the West Bank in pursuit of peace. And they divided up the West Bank into three different territories, three different separate administrative divisions. One area, Area A, controlled completely by the Palestinian Authority. One area, Area B, jointly controlled by the Palestinian Authority and Israel. And Area C, controlled entirely by Israel. Now, Area C contains roughly 60% of the territory in the West Bank and contains all of the Israeli settlements and outposts. There's estimates that between 180 and 280,000 Palestinians live in Area C, by way of comparison to 2.8 million Palestinians who live in Areas A and B. By the same token, about a little bit more than twice that number, just over 400,000 Israelis live in the West Bank, most in Area C. In somewhere just under 200 settlements and several dozen smaller so-called outposts. The areas earmarked for annexation, the areas that would revert to absolute control by the Israeli government, comprise about 30% of the West Bank, and 70% therefore would remain under Palestinian or shared control. Now, on one hand, it's a logical argument to make saying if ultimately the two countries, hopefully two countries someday for those of us who support a two-state solution, but if control of the West Bank is split, one side says, isn't it reasonable that Israel would control only 30% and 70% would remain under Palestinian or shared control? The counter argument, as I think most of you know, is that many believe that giving Israel that portion of the West Bank in terms of absolute authority would make it much, much more difficult to ultimately form a contiguous Palestinian state. And so many opponents of the annexation sovereignty debate believe that annexation, Israel unilaterally taking full control over this portion of the West Bank, would kill the possibility of a two-state solution. The Israelis, on the other hand, believe that establishing sovereignty over this portion of the West Bank would force Palestinians to negotiate, pointing out that negotiations over several decades have never resulted in any real agreement in this regard. So the Israelis who support the annexation or sovereignty, they say this is the only way to get negotiations moving again. Palestinians and their allies say that this would kill any further negotiations and any chance of a two-state solution. One last point, and then I will ask you guys what you think about this, and then we'll go on to our discussion, is I just wanted to find one aspect of this annexation sovereignty discussion. In fact, what does it actually mean if the Israeli government takes absolute control over this portion of the West Bank? And what I will tell you is that the most significant difference under annexation or sovereignty would likely make is in the area of settlement construction. And this has been one of the most difficult issues between Israel and the Palestinians for years. Currently, building and zoning in the West Bank requires the approval of Israel's defense minister and prime minister, and the legal and oversight process can take months or years. If annexation or sovereignty were to take place, decisions about new settlements or outposts within those agreed upon areas would become a local matter and become much easier for Israelis to build. So there's no question that the number of settlers in the West Bank would increase dramatically. The Israelis argue that it would not really affect the geography of those settlements and outposts. The Palestinians argue otherwise. Lots of other things we could talk about in this front, what the United States thinks about this, and the divisions in the Trump administration over whether annexation or sovereignty is a good idea or not. What would happen to this plan, this process in November if Joe Biden were elected president? Another important conversation. And then the other place that we can take the discussion, if you guys like, is to talk about the Israeli politics in this. Because Bibi Netanyahu, Israel's leader, very badly wants his new partner in governance, the defense minister Benny Gantz, to be a supporter of annexation or sovereignty. Gantz has come out against it thus far. And smart people believe that one of the reasons that Netanyahu has not moved forward with the annexation or sovereignty as he had indicated he would last week is because he still believes he can get Gantz to sign on and therefore be able to build much greater support both within Israel and internationally if this scene is something on which the two leaders of Israel actually agree. So let's do this before we go to your questions and your comments. Claire, maybe we can put up the third question now as it relates to Israel. And this is a broader question than simply annexation or sovereignty. It's more of a philosophical question. We'd like to know what should be the most important when it comes to US policy in the Middle East, do you think? Should the US align more closely with Palestinian interests than with the Israelis? Should we align more closely with Israeli interests rather than those of the Palestinians? Or should we try to balance evenly between the two? Let's see what the answer is on this question when we have it ready, Claire. 12% say we should align more closely with Palestinians. 19% say align more closely with Israeli interests, not quite double. but more than 2/3, 69%, say balance evenly between the two. And I think what all of you know, and I will freely acknowledge, and this is the downside of these really fun polls, is that sort of an overly simplistic way of looking at it, because the real question is, what does balancing equally between the two mean? That's a conversation that takes up a lot more time and space than we can address in one poll, but maybe we can talk about it in our conversation as it goes forward. So if the amazing Jessica Duganzik is with us, we can go to your questions. And if there are questions on Israel or any of other topics or anything else you want to talk about this week, let's get to them. Hi, Jessica.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Great job so far. We did also have some member questions submitted early, and they are focused on the annexation topic. So I'm going to start with those, and I know we're kind of going in reverse order, but since it's the topic right now, let's jump into it. The first question is, the country of Jordan was established on 3/4 of the land that at one time comprised the British Mandate of Palestine, leaving 25% to be disputed between Jews and Arabs. A majority of Jordan's inhabitants, 60 to 70%, are Palestinian Arabs. Why is there no agitation by groups expressing support for an independent Palestine state to rename Jordan as Palestine?
Boy, this is a conversation that has taken place for many years. I can go all the way back to the 1980s when I was first beginning to become involved in politics, when the late Congressman Jack Kemp, the Republican from upstate New York, made the same point that the questioner did, but much, much more emphatically. Kemp used to say, there is a Palestinian homeland, it's called Jordan. And I think there's a couple of different answers that I could offer to the questioner. One is many strong supporters of Israel believe, I think with some justification, that much of the Arab world does not want Israel to exist at all. And so therefore creating a Palestinian homeland outside of the disputed area would essentially concede going forward that Israel would exist and continue to exist. The trickier part of this equation relates to the current leadership and population of Jordan. The King of Jordan has actually been one of Israel's strongest supporters in the Arab community for many years. Jordan was one of the first countries to sign a peace agreement with Israel. And over the years, the two countries have worked together very closely on any number of measures, to the point where Israel now trusts Jordan with oversight of the Western Wall and the surrounding area, which is a tremendously disputed area between the Palestinians and the Jews. And while the King of Jordan has come out against annexation or sovereignty publicly and forcefully, it's widely suspected, if not assumed, that he really doesn't have much of a problem with this. Because that the leaders of Jordan, so goes the other argument, is that the leaders of Jordan realize that assuming responsibility for a very large and often unruly and primarily impoverished population of Palestinians would have great economic and social and cultural impact on their country. And the leaders of Jordan, who, like the leaders of most countries, look for stability in the populations that they oversee, see a Palestinian presence, whether as part of an official Palestinian state or Jordan, or even a relocation of large numbers of Palestinian refugees, is a threat to that stability. So some of it has to do with harder line Arab attitudes toward Israel. But interestingly enough, the bigger challenge isn't from Israel's strongest enemies in the Arab world, but actually from their closest allies.
Thank you. After over 75 years of non-resolution of the Palestinian problem, shouldn't a step which may lead to a different solution, for example, single Israeli nation from the Jordan to the Mediterranean, with a sizable minority like exists in Israel today, protected by the best of minority rights legislation and implementation, be desirable?
Well, it's an option that is desirable for many in this discussion. The argument in favor of that, of course, is rather than trying to divide a relatively small part of territory in two, is simply allow a Jewish state with enhanced legal protections and powers for Palestinians to exist. The counter argument to that is based in demographics. The Jewish population of Israel is growing more slowly than the population of Palestinians. And so many supporters of Israel are concerned that a one-state solution, regardless of how the populations within that country work together and live together, their concern is that one country, the demographics of it, would very quickly lead to a country with a Jewish minority and an Arab majority. And even the late Ariel Sharon, one of Israel's, say, most combative leaders over the course of its history, ultimately began to argue for a two-state solution simply because, as he believed, it was a matter of demographic protection. And he warned his people. He said, if Israel is one country of both Jews and Palestinians, ultimately we'll have to choose between being a Jewish state and a democratic state. Whereas he believed having a separate Palestinian nation would be preferable. We're no closer to solving that argument now than we were during Sharon's heyday. But the arguments on both sides, as the questioner pointed out, are almost completely unchanged. Over the course of 75 years, that on one hand is what's led to the Israeli frustration that brought them to the point of moving on annexation or sovereignty. But on the other side, there's equal levels of frustration as well, and equal levels of disagreement on whether one or two states is a better answer for the Palestinian people too.
Thank you. And Jane actually asked a similar question on that, and you answered it. So Jane, I hope that his response answered your question as well. The next one, when did the leadership in the American Jewish community become so conservative? Is it blind loyalty to whichever party is in control of the Israeli government? Or has there been a change over time in terms of values and the old belief in a two-state solution with limiting annexation?
Well, I think the question is a fascinating one, but I think I actually look at it slightly differently than the questioner does. What I think has happened over the years since my first engagement on this issue many decades ago is that both sides of the debate in the American Jewish community have become more polarized and more intense in their opposition to each other. Now, some of that has to do with Israeli politics, as Netanyahu and his Likud predecessors have pushed a much more aggressive line than the Labor Party had done when they were in power. That does, as the questioner suggested, create a larger level of support among conservatives and pro-Israel voices in the American Jewish community, and created greater concerns, reluctance on the part of more progressive American Jews. And I'm being very careful with my language here because I realize the terms progressive and conservative, while we use them pretty glibly in American politics, don't always apply quite as neatly, either in Israeli politics or in international geopolitics. But what I do think has happened, more than one side or the other becoming more empowered, becoming more aggressive, is American Jews aren't just Jewish. We're Americans. And we've lived in an American society that has become increasingly polarized and increasingly balkanized and increasingly hyper-partisan over the decades. So it shouldn't come as much surprise that if the American population and American electorate overall has continued to depopulate the political center and move toward more intense feelings on both the left and the right, it shouldn't surprise us that those same tendencies exist within the Jewish community. No question that an aggressive Likud effort on any number of fronts has made it more difficult for many left-leaning Jews to remain as supportive of Israel as they had in the past. And that probably almost certainly has had, as I mentioned a moment ago, a corresponding empowering effect among conservative and stronger pro-Zionist voices. But I think more than anything, more than Netanyahu, more than Likud, more than the diminution of labor is a force in Israeli politics, I think this has more to do with simply the greater polarization of American politics. And Israel is one more issue, like climate change, like healthcare, like any number of others, on which we tend to argue from a further ideological distance than we might have in the past.
Thank you. Are American Jews more likely to support one of the several non-two-state solutions to the Palestine-Israel dispute? For example, one Israel state with a large minority, like now exists today with 20% non-Jews as citizens in a democratic Israel.
Okay. There's a growing amount of support in the American Jewish community and more broadly for a one-state solution since Sharon began talking about the two-state answer many years ago. But at the risk of, I try not to take sides in these discussions, as all of you guys know, but I have a very strong opinion on this one, and it's very similar to Sharon's, is that for Israel to remain both a Jewish state and a democratic state, that simply necessitates a two-state solution. And while there is increasing interest on both sides of the debate about moving to one state instead, both Israelis and Palestinians, I suspect, and there may be some of you watching today who disagree with my generalization, but my own belief is that most of those who are now pushing for a one-state solution are doing so out of frustration, if not exhaustion, given at the lack of progress that's been made on creating an independent Palestinian state, bringing this discussion back to the point about annexation and sovereignty. I've seen any number of thoughtful voices make the case in print that one of the ways to solve this particular dilemma would be for the Israeli government to pair its moves towards sovereignty or annexation with an even more concrete proposal for a Palestinian state, to move the two forward simultaneously rather than one after the other. But I can't blame people for getting tired of this discussion and looking for an alternative, because it has been going on for quite some time.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a complicating topic, and I know the 7 years I've been at the council, we've talked about it a lot. This questioner says, Israel's West Bank annexation plan is condemned by UN experts and violates international law. If similar events were occurring anywhere else in the world, the US would condemn these actions as an invasion and ethnic cleansing. Why do we look the other way when Israel is the occupying power?
I've talked in this webinar in the past, and I mean no disrespect to the questioner, because it's an important question. But on other issues over the course of the months that we've been talking, I've used the term selective outrage, where really smart people on either side of a debate tend to get much more angry or forceful when someone on the other side of the debate does something they believe is wrong, and then find reasons to either excuse or ignore transgression committed by their allies. And while I think this idea of selective outrage exists in almost every corner of American domestic politics, nowhere does it exist more than on issues relating to Israel and the Palestinians. I think the question doesn't defend Palestinian instigated violence, but I think would benefit from recognizing that violence as a contributing factor to the types of Israeli actions that the question is referring to. And so I think one of Israel's greatest frustrations is that the international community, not just in the Arab world, but in Europe as well, Israel believes that they are being judged by a double standard that other countries are not held to when defending themselves against violence, against terrorism, against other types of transgressions. And of course, Israel's critics believe that Israel is being held to a double standard, but excused for behavior that would be condemned elsewhere in the world. There's legitimate points within both arguments, but I think until both sides become more willing to acknowledge shortcomings on their part, even if they hasten to point out that their shortcomings are not nearly as horrific as those on the other side, until there's more of a tendency toward mutual acknowledgement and mutual responsibility, I don't know that we'll make great progress as challenging an issue as this one.
Thank you. Jewish people continually vote Democrat, yet it is Republicans who support Israel. Can you explain that?
I can try. As many of you know, I worked in Republican politics for many years, and about 9 or 10 years ago, switched my party registration to no party preference. And over the years, I'll occasionally talk to my friends in my former party who will raise just that question. And they'll say, why do American Jews vote so heavily Democratic, given how supportive Republicans are of Israel? And I guess I'll offer a couple of thoughts on this, Jessica. One is a matter not of opinion in terms of preference, but rather in terms of priority. And what I mean by that is in the early years of the 21st century, long around 2004, American Jewish political opinion reached a tipping point as a result of a trend that had been taking place for many years. But in 2004's presidential election between John Kerry and George Bush, it's the first time since 1948 where, according to public opinion polling, the majority of American Jews did not list Israel as their top policy priority in casting their ballot. From 1948, Harry Truman's elections to the 2000 Bush-Gore campaign, Israel ranked as American Jewish voters' top policy priority in gradually diminishing margins. And by 2004, when Bush ran for re-election against then Senator Kerry, we saw that tip. And from 2004 until now, smaller and smaller numbers of American Jews list Israel as their top policy priority, and more members of the American Jewish community instead will list any number of domestic, cultural, social issues as their top priority. So what I tell the people in the Republican Party who want to know why they're not being rewarded by American Jews for what they believe is very strong advocacy on Israel's behalf, I say, I think you got two challenges here. One is American Jews have simply decided that while Israel is important to them, your party's positioning on social and cultural issues like abortion rights, like environmental protection, like healthcare, like same-sex marriage are issues of greater concern to these voters. And so you're not going to win a greater number of American Jews, no matter what you say or do on Israel, unless you decide it's in your interest to adjust on these social and cultural matters as well. The second thing I point out when I asked about this by a Republican advocate of Israel, I said it's not as if most American Jewish voters, look at this as a choice between a party that's good on Israel and a party that's bad on Israel. I think if you really drill down, what you'd find is that most, not all, most Jewish American voters would say there's one party, the Democrats, that are very, very, very good on Israel. There's another party, the Republicans, that are very, 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 very good on Israel. And that one extra very, as opposed to a much more black and white pro or anti position, isn't enough to switch voters who have such a strong concern about domestic issues as well.
Thank you. Where are the Muslim majority countries in supporting Palestinians?
Okay. Almost all of the Muslim majority countries in the world are fairly strong supporters of the Palestinian effort, not just in the Arab world, but beyond. I think of greater concern to Israel is the increasing support for the Palestinian cause in the European countries as well. Israel, frankly, has never made a tremendous effort toward a considered public relations strategy, if you will. And I think by not making more of an effort on the world stage to have its message heard in a compelling and persuasive way, they end up sacrificing potential pockets of support that might exist for them in the international community. Now, that's easy for me to say. I'm an American Jew who lives in Los Angeles, and I don't worry about the threat of terrorism every day. So I'm not going to presume the decisions that people who take much greater risks than I do. I'm not going to criticize the decisions they make. But without taking sides one way or another, I'd simply observe, as a former media and messaging and communication specialist, that if the Israeli government were more invested in its making its case to an international audience, that might lead to additional support for them in quarters that they might not expect. The one other thing I'd add to this, I feel that there's a tremendous opportunity here that's being missed, not just by the state of Israel, but by American Jews as well. And I think if we look at the horrific persecution that's being suffered by Muslims in Northwest China, I think that there is an opportunity, not just for political or geopolitical reasons, but for moral reasons, for a Jewish community here and elsewhere to stand up much more loudly and aggressively in defense of those being persecuted. And I wonder if standing up on behalf of those aggrieved and persecuted and exterminated Muslims might lead to a broader beneficial conversation. I don't know any Jew here or in other countries that supports what the Chinese government is doing. But once again, it's not a question of being on one side or the other. It's a question of time and effort and intensity.
Thank you. Can you discuss the anti-Israel stance of the Black Lives Matter movement?
So just to clarify, the Black Lives Matter movement itself has very studiously not taken any position on most issues relating to Israel or American Jews. They have an affiliated organization, and the relationships between those two organizations is somewhat murky. That has been very aggressive and very critical and very intolerant, in my opinion, in their comments, primarily about Israel. But as we all know, anti-Zionism can ooze into anti-Semitism fairly quickly. This puts the American Jewish community in a pretty precarious situation, particularly in a time of national racial discussion and reconsideration. The Jewish community in this country for decades has been very committed to civil rights and to social justice and to racial justice. On the other hand, and I wrote the piece on this for the Jewish Journal just a couple of weeks ago, I think it is reasonable for American Jews facing heightened examples of anti-Semitism in this country and elsewhere to ask if this community, our community, is consistently willing to stand up on behalf of others who face bigotry and prejudice. That at some point should there not be an expectation, or at least a hope, for more of a two-way commitment in that regard. Black Lives Matter is not the only African American community organization in the country. There's plenty of others that are held in very high regard. But at this particular moment, they're enjoying a tremendous amount of attention and support. And so there's a real challenge both for the Jewish community and for communities of color to figure out how to improve a conversation that, in my own opinion, frankly, has been allowed to wither since the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s.
Thank you. Where is Biden historically on the annexation question?
Biden has expressed his deep concern, if not outright opposition, to annexation and sovereignty. And I think what the Netanyahu government is attempting to calculate right now is knowing that even while there are debates within the Trump administration about whether this is the right thing to do, it's been reported that Jared Huffman, the architect of the Trump peace plan and the president's son-in-law, is opposed to annexation and sovereignty because he thinks it'll kill the peace plan. David Friedman, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, on the other hand, thinks that annexation and sovereignty is preferable to the Trump administration peace plan. But on balance, there's a belief by Netanyahu and his advisors that the Trump administration and that the president himself would be very supportive if they do go forward with this move. It's their understanding, and I think mine as well, that Biden is much less likely to be supportive of it. He has spoken in opposition, but in fairly measured ways. And the gamble that they are weighing right now is, if you're Netanyahu, do you move on annexation or sovereignty while Trump is president, knowing that even if Biden is not comfortable with it, would President Biden be willing to push to force the Israeli government to reverse the annexation sovereignty movement. The other example that is relevant in this area is the move of the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Vice President Biden opposed that move, but has also made it very clear that now that the embassy is moving to Jerusalem, he would not necessarily reverse that move. So in both cases, Netanyahu's gamble is that if something has occurred, Biden is much less likely to reverse that decision than he might be to oppose a decision that has not been implemented. It's worth noting that Vice President Biden did receive a letter earlier this week from a number of progressive organizations in this country in which they laid out a set of concerns about his foreign policy and national security appointments if he were to be elected president. And they made it very clear that they thought that anyone who had opposed the Iran nuclear agreement and anyone who had and anyone who had spoken out in favor of settlements or annexation sovereignty should be disqualified from a Biden administration. Now, longer conversation than we have time for today on the growing divide within the Democratic Party over Israel and the Middle East. But there's no question that if there is a President Biden, he'll face tremendous pressure from his party's base to move further from Israel, just like President Trump gets that kind of feedback from the far right in the Republican Party and other with other challenges that relate to nationalism and intolerance.
Thank you. Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you. Joe Biden has said police have become the enemy and supports defunding. With the recent increases in violent crime in Democrat-run cities, how will Joe Biden defend the president's depiction of Biden being on the wrong end of law and order?
Okay. So I will admit that while I've read quite a bit about what Vice President Biden has said about the police reform movement, and there's no shortage of voices in his party who are calling for full defunding, and some calling for absolute abolishment of the police forces. I'm not aware of Biden himself taking that extreme a position. I understand that Biden has talked about moving some funds from police to social service organizations. But on balance, if I'm not mistaken, his platform actually calls for an increase in funding for police departments for money very specifically earmarked for community policing. Now, because Biden is not as forceful on this issue as Trump is, and because there are so many voices in the Democratic Party calling for much more extreme measures in the police reform debate than Biden is himself, it's not surprising that the president and his allies are trying to paint Biden as being a favor of full police defunding. But I'm not aware of any statements or actions that Vice President Biden has taken in that regard. As the election progresses, the president's supporters will argue that Biden, while he might not have said it himself, is under the control of the more extreme voices in the Democratic Party who will push for a Green New Deal and for universal and for single-payer healthcare and full police defunding. Biden's challenge will be to push back against that in order to distance himself from the most intense voices in his own party in a way that allows him to attract centrist voters, but doesn't cost him support from the Democratic base. So if I've missed something that Biden has said or written, I'll apologize to the questioner, but I'm not aware that he himself has taken the type of position that the question suggests.
Thank you. Would it do any good if the House of Representatives pursues the president's records in light of the recent SCOTUS decision?
Sorry, Jessica, can you ask that question again?
Sure. Would it do any good if the House of Representatives pursues the president's records in light of the recent Supreme Court decision?
At this point, it's probably a matter less for Congress than it is for the courts. As we talked about earlier, the Supreme Court decided that this is a decision that should be revisited by lower courts and then returned to the Supreme Court at some future date. So I think if Congress is going to be able to access those types of financial records, it's going to be something that's decided by the judicial branch rather than the legislative branch. That said, I do believe, given the court's decision this morning on the New York case, that at some point they will rule that those subpoenas for the president's financial records are valid, and Congress will achieve control of them at some point in the future, albeit at some point well after the election. And so even though it's not ultimately in their control, I suspect it makes sense for Congress to continue to lay claim to Trump's financial records. So if and when the court does act in their favor, they're in a position to access them. Thank
you. What are the chances that Trump's tax returns will be leaked to the media before November?
Boy, that is a tough question, and it's asking me to make a prediction. And as all of you know, I say no to predictions and yes to coffee. But I will say this: once the court machinations have been completed on this, the information will go to a grand jury. So in other words, once the court's finished with the New York case, it's not that the information will become public immediately, but rather the grand jury will access the president's financial and business transactions in order to determine if there was criminal behavior or not. The penalties for leaking information out of a grand jury are very, very strong. And so while I wouldn't say it's impossible, given how strongly people feel about this case and about the election, I would say that leaking out of Congress is pretty much pro forma. Leaking out of most business or government entities happens pretty frequently. Grand jury leaks are much fewer and far between, so while it's not impossible, it would require a much more aggressive judgment on the part of a member of the grand jury or staffer, because the legal consequences would be very significant.
Thank you. Do you think we have time for one more?
Yeah, let's get in one more.
Okay. Thomas Friedman wrote 2 days ago in the New York Times that Biden should refuse to debate Trump unless he, 1, releases his tax returns, and 2, that a real-time fact-checking team should also be present. What are your thoughts on this? And should debates be a bargaining chip for candidates?
Well, Tom Friedman is a very, very smart man. And going back to what we talked about earlier today, he's one of our nation's most astute observers on Middle Eastern politics and geopolitics. On American campaign politics, I'll just say diplomatically, that's an area on which he has spent less time over the years. And my own opinion is that any presidential candidate, Biden, or as it was rumored earlier this year, Trump, any presidential candidate who refuses to debate, given the construct that's set up for debates every 4 years, would be absolutely vilified. And I don't think Biden, even with a considerable lead in the polls, can afford to have the political conversation distracted by an ongoing debate about why he is not willing to debate the president. It doesn't do him any good at all. And as far as a real-time fact-checking entity, that exists. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of real-time fact-checking entities that exist in an age of internet and social media. And whether those fact-checkers are physically present in the debate hall or watching the debate on television or online, and then offering their judgment on when the candidates are being truthful and when they're not, I think accomplishes pretty much the same goal. So I don't agree with Mr. Friedman on his first idea. On his second one, I think it's very smart. I think it's very necessary, and I think it's already going to be done.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. Kim, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Dan, thank you again for a very illustrative discussion. I can't wait for next Thursday and to hear what your 3 topics are going to be. Who knows what the news cycle's going to present us next week. So thank you so very much. In addition to Dan's program next Thursday, we've got a terrific lineup for you. July 14th, we have William Drozdiak, who is from the Brookings Institute, who will be in discussion with Ambassador John Emerson on a Bastille Day discussion on Emmanuel Macron, France, and Europe's place in the world. on July 16th. That's our politics in the time of coronavirus with Dan. July 20th is climate change, the biggest environmental change. And July 21st, reimagining education post-COVID-19. And another special program with Dan Schnur as moderator. We're bringing in U.S. Senator Tim Scott on July 28th. So that will be interesting as well.
We'll have a chance to talk to him about police reform and see if our audience here today was overly pessimistic or if he has any reason to offer us some encouragement.
Can't wait. So thank you, everyone. Stay informed, stay safe, and we'll see you next week. Take care. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, everybody.